It was a Saturday afternoon when everything changed. I had been scrolling through my social media feed, looking for nothing in particular, when a notification popped up. It was a new post from a mutual friend of mine and Julia's. I opened it, half expecting yet another banal update about someone's vacation or dinner party. Instead, what I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. The post was filled with photos from a recent weekend getaway at a remote lodge, photos I had never seen before. I leaned in closer, squinting at the screen as the images loaded. And then, my heart sank. In one of the pictures, Julia was wrapped in a warm embrace with none other than Matt, her boss. The image was striking. Julia, looking radiant and carefree, was laughing, her arms around Matt's neck as he held her close. It was clear they were more than just colleagues, there was an intimacy in their gestures that spoke volumes. The photos were tagged with the location and time, and I could see the comments pouring in from mutual acquaintances, speculating about the nature of their relationship. I clicked through more pictures, each one adding to the growing pit in my stomach. They were inseparable in every shot, dining together, dancing, and even sharing a moment where Julia rested her head on Matt's shoulder. It was like watching a cruel mockery of what we had once been. As the initial shock wore off, a cold wave of anger and confusion began to seep in. How had Julia been so careless? Did she not think about the consequences of her actions? I knew I had to get to the bottom of this. But right now, I could barely process the enormity of what I had just uncovered. Scrolling through the comments, I saw a mix of surprise, pity, and judgment. Some people seemed to take pleasure in the scandal, while others expressed their disappointment. I was paralyzed, unable to do anything but stare at the screen, as if somehow the truth could change if I just looked at it long enough. The posts continued to spread like wildfire, with more people joining the conversation and speculating about the story behind the photos. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends, their concerned or curious inquiries only adding to my sense of betrayal. This was not how I imagined finding out. I had suspected something was wrong for a while now, but seeing these images, these undeniable proofs of Julia's betrayal, was like having a rug yanked out from under me. The reality of it hit me hard. It wasn't just about what Julia had done, it was about how it was laid bare for the entire world to see. I closed my phone and took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. It was time to confront Julia. There was no going back now, the damage was done, and the world had seen it. The next steps were mine to decide, and I needed to act carefully, but first, I needed to come to terms with the fact that everything I thought I knew had just been turned upside down. As the days went by, the initial shock of the photos began to fade, but the unease remained. Julia, on the other hand, seemed to be thriving in a way that was both perplexing and unsettling. Her newfound energy and radiant smile were almost too much to ignore. It was as if the turmoil I was grappling with was a mere footnote to her vibrant new chapter. She moved through our home with an infectious enthusiasm, humming her favorite tunes and engaging in cheerful conversations that felt strangely out of place. It was clear she was happier than she had been in months, perhaps even years. Her laughter rang through the house, but it was hollow to my ears, a cruel contrast to the turmoil I was feeling inside. One evening, Julia came home with a bright, eager expression on her face, clutching a sleek, brand-new phone. She showed it to me with an exaggerated flourish, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Look what I got," she announced as if it were the most thrilling purchase of her life. I glanced at the phone, a model I knew was quite expensive. "Nice," I replied, my voice flat despite my effort to sound interested. She beamed at me, oblivious to my detached tone. "I used my bonus for this. Thought it was time for an upgrade." It struck me as odd. Julia had never been one to splurge on high-end gadgets, and the timing of her purchase seemed questionable. With the recent photos still fresh in my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection. Her newfound happiness and the new phone seemed like symptoms of a larger, underlying issue. I found myself scrutinizing her more closely. Little things, like the way she answered her phone with a guarded smile or her sudden desire to go out more often, started to feel suspicious. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from me, and her behavior only intensified those doubts. The new phone, in particular, was a glaring reminder of her sudden windfall. I knew she hadn't mentioned any significant bonuses recently, nor had she mentioned any financial gain that would explain such a lavish purchase. It was almost as if she was trying to flaunt something, a gesture that felt both dismissive and provocative. The more I thought about it, the more I began to question everything. Was Julia's exuberance a facade, or was there something more sinister at play? Her behavior was erratic and unsettling, a sharp contrast to the calm and collected woman I had known for years. I resolved to dig deeper, to uncover the truth behind these sudden changes. If I was to confront her about the photos and the suspiciously timed purchase, I needed more than just gut feelings, I needed evidence. The contrast between her apparent joy and the underlying sense of betrayal was becoming impossible to ignore. The more Julia's behavior grew increasingly conspicuous, the more my suspicion began to fester. Her constant cheerfulness and the extravagant new phone seemed like a smokescreen, hiding something far more troubling. With every passing day, the question of what she was hiding gnawed at me. One evening, while Julia was out running one of her errands, I found myself alone in our study. The new phone left charging on the desk caught my eye. It seemed almost too perfect, shiny, new, and a glaring symbol of her recent change in demeanor. My heart pounded as I glanced at it, feeling an unsettling mix of dread and determination. I approached the phone, my hands slightly trembling. It was locked with a fingerprint scan and a passcode, both of which I didn't know. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. I had to find out what Julia was hiding. With the determination of someone who has reached the end of their rope, I set to work. I had once read about methods to bypass phone security, and while they seemed far-fetched, desperation made me resourceful. After some trial and error, I managed to find a way to access her call logs and text messages. The process was far from foolproof, and the risk of getting caught was real, but I had no other choice. The phone's call history revealed a series of frequent, intimate conversations between Julia and Matt. The sheer volume of these calls and their content left no room for doubt. They spoke in tones that were far too familiar, their conversations dripping with private jokes and plans that went beyond mere professionalism. It was like reading a diary of their affair. I scrolled through text messages next, my pulse quickening with each discovery. The texts were filled with terms of endearment and plans for secret meetings. They referred to each other in ways that suggested a deep, personal connection. There were mentions of places I had never heard of and times I knew Julia had been working late or out with friends. Every message felt like a dagger to my heart, a confirmation of what the photos had only hinted at. The betrayal was no longer a vague notion, it was a stark, painful reality laid out before me in black and white. Each text, each call log, was a piece of a puzzle that formed a picture of deceit and infidelity. As I went through the evidence, the rage I felt was almost overwhelming. Julia had been living a double life, her smiles and newfound joy a cover for the lies she was weaving. The new phone, once a symbol of her supposed success, was now a symbol of her treachery. I knew I had to confront her, but part of me wanted to gather more evidence, to ensure that there was no room for her to deny the truth. The next steps had to be carefully calculated. My emotions were a chaotic storm, but one thing was clear, the facade was over, and the truth was out in the open. Armed with the damning evidence from Julia's phone, my mind raced with the implications of what I had uncovered. The texts and call logs were more than just indicators of an affair. They were detailed accounts of their plans, their intentions, and their secret rendezvous. It was like a blueprint for their deceit, laid out for me to see. The messages between Julia and Matt were filled with coded language and euphemisms, but the patterns were unmistakable. They scheduled their meetings with a precision that spoke of careful planning. Each text seemed to map out a hidden world of rendezvous and clandestine encounters. Their communications were frequent, and their discussions about special times and private places made it clear that their relationship went far beyond professional boundaries. One particular exchange caught my eye. Julia was discussing a specific weekend getaway, mentioning how excited she was about a special night with Matt. The message was filled with anticipation, and the plans included details about what time they would meet and how they would ensure there were no interruptions. The way they spoke about these meetings, with such eagerness and secrecy, was both heartbreaking and enraging. As I sifted through the messages, it became evident that Julia had been living a double life. The details of their plans, their affection for each other, and their careful avoidance of detection painted a clear picture of betrayal. This wasn't just an affair, it was a calculated deception that had been going on for months. The more I read, the more the betrayal stung. Each message, Each scheduled meeting was a testament to their disregard for our marriage and the trust we had built over the years. Julia's planning and scheming were meticulous, and it was clear that she and Matt had worked hard to keep their affair hidden from me. It was overwhelming to process all this information. The reality of Julia's betrayal was now undeniable, and the extent of their planning was a painful revelation. I had enough evidence to confront her, but I wanted to be certain that I had every detail right. There could be no room for her to deny the truth or make excuses. I needed to prepare for the confrontation carefully, ensuring that the full scope of her betrayal was laid bare. The plot was now fully unveiled, and the path forward was clear. It was time to confront Julia, but I had to make sure I was ready. The truth was out, and now it was time to face it head on. With the painful reality of Julia's betrayal etched deeply into my mind, a new resolve took shape, one driven by a desire for retribution. My focus shifted to Matt, the man who had not only shattered my marriage but also brazenly flaunted his deceit. I decided that the best way to confront the injustice was to hit him where it would matter most, his career and personal reputation. The first step in my plan was to collect as much compromising information about Matt as possible. I began by investigating his professional dealings. Matt was a prominent figure in his industry, which meant his career was built on a web of business relationships and corporate partnerships. If I could find any cracks in this web, it might be enough to bring him down. I started by digging into Matt's business history. I reviewed company reports, checked for discrepancies, and looked into any past legal issues. The more I dug, the more I uncovered minor financial irregularities, questionable transactions, and a few unresolved conflicts with former business partners. None of these were damning on their own, but together they began to form a troubling picture. I also investigated Matt's connections. It seemed likely that he had crossed paths with influential people who might have vested interests in his downfall if presented with the right information. I reached out to industry insiders, looking for gossip, insider knowledge, or any potentially scandalous details that could be used to my advantage. Next, I turned my attention to Matt's personal life. His public persona was polished and controlled, but I suspected there were cracks beneath the surface. I delved into his social media profiles and public records, searching for inconsistencies or evidence of questionable behavior. His posts about extravagant vacations and expensive tastes seemed conspicuous in light of the financial irregularities I had already found. As I dug deeper, I found a few interesting leads, reports of unpaid debts, a history of disputes with family members, and even hints of personal conflicts that might resonate publicly. There were also rumors about his interactions with certain individuals, suggestions of unethical behavior or questionable business practices. Each piece of information I gathered was a potential weapon in my plan. My strategy was to compile a comprehensive dossier on Matt, one that would include everything from his professional missteps to personal scandals. Once I had enough material, I planned to use it strategically, either by leaking it to the right people or leveraging it to force Matt into a vulnerable position. The process was meticulous and time-consuming, but every discovery was a step toward balancing the scales. The more I uncovered, the more the idea of revenge began to take shape. My goal was not just to punish Matt, but to make sure that his professional and personal lives felt the full impact of his betrayal. The plan was coming together, piece by piece. It was time to prepare for the next phase, executing the strategy that would ensure Matt faced the consequences of his actions, and I could find some semblance of justice for the pain he had caused. The dossier was complete, a meticulously assembled collection of Matt's professional misdeeds and personal failings. Each page was a testament to his duplicity, a calculated counterattack designed to dismantle the life he had so carelessly upended. The time had come to unleash this carefully gathered information. I chose my targets with precision. Matt's competitors were the first to receive the details of his financial irregularities and business conflicts. I made sure the information was compelling enough to stir up their interest without giving them a chance to doubt its authenticity. The goal was to create a ripple effect that would spread quickly through the industry. The next step was to leak the most scandalous details to the media. I crafted anonymous tips and sent them to journalists known for their investigative work. The information was explosive. Revelations about shady business practices, questionable financial dealings, and personal scandals. I made sure to include evidence that was difficult to dismiss, including documents and records that could substantiate my claims. As expected, the media picked up the story with sensational headlines. The scandal unfolded publicly, capturing the attention of industry insiders and the general public alike. Articles about Matt's misdeeds appeared everywhere, from business news outlets to tabloid magazines. The once respected executive was now the subject of ridicule and scorn. The repercussions were swift and severe. Matt's company, previously a powerhouse in its field, began to experience a dramatic fall from grace. Long-standing contracts were terminated, and business relationships dissolved as clients distanced themselves from the tarnished reputation. The company's stock value plummeted, and the negative press only fueled the downward spiral. Inside the company, chaos reigned. Employees and partners were left scrambling to salvage what they could from the wreckage of Matt's downfall. The public scrutiny and mounting legal challenges took their toll, and it became clear that Matt's empire was unraveling. The very foundation of his career was being shaken to its core. As the scandal grew, I watched with a mix of satisfaction and vindication. Matt's carefully constructed world of success and prestige was crumbling, piece by piece. His downfall was a direct consequence of the betrayal he had orchestrated, a stark reminder of the price of deceit. Julia, too, felt the reverberations of the scandal. The chaos surrounding Matt had its ripples, affecting her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. As the public scrutiny intensified, she found herself caught in the fallout, facing questions and judgments from those who had once been her peers. The calculated revenge had succeeded beyond my expectations. Matt's professional reputation was in tatters, and his company had suffered significant losses. It was a harsh justice, but one that seemed fitting for the magnitude of his betrayal. As the dust settled and the initial shock of the scandal began to fade, I took a moment to reflect. The plan had been executed with precision, and the consequences had been profound. In the end, the path of revenge had not only served to balance the scales but had also delivered a powerful message about the cost of betrayal and deceit. As the dust began to settle from the explosive revelations about Matt, a new drama unfolded. The aftermath of the scandal had hit Matt and Julia like a sledgehammer, leaving them scrambling to salvage what was left of their shattered lives. The walls were closing in, and their once secure world was collapsing under the weight of the revelations. Matt was the first to show signs of panic. The media frenzy had reached a fever pitch, and the fallout from the leaked information was taking its toll. His once pristine reputation was now marred by accusations and scrutiny. He was no longer just a businessman facing a rough patch. He was the poster child for corporate misconduct and personal scandal. In his desperate attempt to regain control, Matt began seeking legal advice and crisis management experts. He threw money at the problem, hiring public relations firms and legal teams to mitigate the damage. His company's board of directors was in a constant state of emergency meetings, trying to navigate the chaos and figure out how to distance themselves from the scandal. They even attempted to spin the narrative, blaming external factors and attempting to downplay Matt's role in the mess. But the media wasn't buying it. Stories continued to surface, and the public's interest in Matt's downfall showed no signs of waning. As the company's stock value plummeted further and clients continued to withdraw, the pressure on Matt intensified. Every attempt to clean up the mess seemed to backfire, only adding fuel to the fire of his deteriorating reputation. Meanwhile, Julia found herself caught in the crossfire. The scandal had not only tarnished Matt's reputation but had also impacted her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her association with Matt was now a liability, and the whispers of their affair had become common knowledge. Friends and colleagues who once admired her were now judging her harshly, and the social circles she had once moved in were becoming increasingly hostile. Julia's attempts to distance herself from Matt and the scandal were futile. She tried to spin her version of events, but the public was already entrenched in the narrative of betrayal and deceit. She faced mounting questions from both her personal and professional circles, each one more probing than the last. Desperate to save face, Julia and Matt tried to orchestrate a series of public apologies and gestures of remorse. They issued statements, attended damage control meetings, and even made charitable donations in an attempt to rehabilitate their images. But these efforts often seemed insincere, further fueling public cynicism and anger. The situation was spiraling out of control. Matt's company was on the brink of financial ruin, and Julia was facing professional and social ostracism. The very tools they had once used to maintain their facade were now turned against them, magnifying the extent of their downfall. As their world continued to unravel, both Matt and Julia struggled to find a way out of the mess they had created. They sought legal counsel and media advisors, and even turned to personal support networks for help. But with each passing day, the reality of their situation became clearer. The consequences of their actions were far-reaching, and their efforts to mitigate the damage were increasingly ineffectual. In their panic, a stark truth emerged: there was no quick fix for the repercussions they faced. The consequences of their betrayal were unfolding in real time, and their once secure lives were now a cautionary tale of how greed and deception can unravel even the most carefully constructed facades. The once thriving affair between Julia and Matt was now teetering on the brink of collapse. The scandal that had engulfed Matt's career had not only decimated his professional standing but was also wreaking havoc on their connection. Julia watched helplessly as the world they had built together unraveled, her dreams of a perfect escape rapidly dissolving into a bitter reality. Julia's initial excitement about her relationship with Matt had been driven by the thrill of the affair and the allure of their secret meetings. But as Matt's career plummeted and his personal life became a public spectacle, the very foundation of their connection began to crumble. What had once seemed like a grand escape now felt like a house of cards, collapsing under the weight of its deceit. The fallout from the scandal had left Matt's company in shambles. Contracts were lost, partners withdrew, and the once respected executive was now a symbol of corporate failure. The financial strain and public humiliation took their toll on Matt's demeanor. He was no longer the confident, charismatic man Julia had known. He was a shadow of his former self, consumed by stress and desperation. Julia began to see the cracks in their relationship that had previously been masked by their shared excitement and secrecy. The grand plans and promises they had made to each other seemed hollow in the face of their crumbling reality. The late-night conversations and secret rendezvous, once filled with passion, were now tinged with tension and regret. She tried to reach out to Matt, to offer comfort and support, but he was increasingly distant. The pressures of his failing career and the public scrutiny had turned him into a person Julia barely recognized. His once charming demeanor was replaced by frustration and anger, and he began to lash out, taking his frustrations out on those around him, including her. Julia's feelings of disillusionment grew stronger as she faced the consequences of their actions. The affair that had once seemed like a thrilling escape now felt like a cruel joke. The support she had hoped for from Matt was replaced by a shared misery that only deepened her sense of betrayal. Her professional life, too, was suffering. The scandal had cast a long shadow over her reputation, and she was now dealing with the fallout in her career. The moments they once cherished together now felt tainted by their shared misdeeds. The places they had once visited with such joy were now reminders of their fall from grace. Julia began to realize that their relationship, built on deception and betrayal, was unsustainable. The thrill had given way to a heavy, suffocating burden. As the reality of their situation set in, Julia felt a deep sense of regret. The dream of a perfect life with Matt was slipping through her fingers, replaced by a painful truth: their relationship was a casualty of their own making. The grand escape they had envisioned was now a shattered illusion, and the weight of their choices was bearing down on them both. In the quiet moments of reflection, Julia faced the stark reality of her situation. The affair that had once seemed so exciting and fulfilling had become a source of deep disappointment. The cracks in their relationship had widened into chasms, and the dreams they had shared now seemed like distant, unfulfilled fantasies. The fallout from their actions had not only destroyed Matt's career but had also left Julia grappling with the ruins of their once passionate connection. The scandal had cast a long shadow over our lives, and the emotional landscape was now fraught with tension and sorrow. Julia, reeling from the collapse of her relationship with Matt and the fallout from the scandal, found herself at a loss. Desperate to repair the rift between us, she reached out to me, hoping to find some semblance of solace or reconciliation. But the situation was far from straightforward. Julia's attempts to reconnect with me were met with a cold, detached response. I kept my emotions tightly controlled, carefully maintaining the facade of ignorance about her affair with Matt. Every time she approached me with a tentative smile or a hesitant gesture of affection, I responded with a calculated distance. My heart was a battleground of conflicting emotions, but I made sure my outward demeanor remained composed and impassive. She tried to engage in conversations about our relationship, attempting to rekindle the warmth we once shared. But I remained aloof, offering only polite, non-committal replies. I acted as if nothing had changed, as if the betrayal and heartbreak were mere figments of her imagination. My silence was deliberate, a way to maintain control and force her to confront the reality of her actions without the comfort of my understanding. Julia's demeanor shifted from hopeful to despondent. The emotional pressure was beginning to take its toll on her. The strain of dealing with Matt's crumbling career, the public scrutiny, and the shattered state of our relationship had left her feeling isolated and defeated. Her attempts at mending fences only seemed to widen the gap between us. The once vibrant spark in Julia's eyes was now replaced by a look of profound sadness. She wandered through our shared spaces with a heaviness that spoke volumes, her attempts at normalcy overshadowed by the weight of her guilt and regret. The vibrant energy that had once characterized her was replaced by a quiet, subdued presence. The contrast between the woman I had once known and the person before me was stark and painful. In our interactions, she displayed a growing sense of desolation. Her gestures of affection grew more desperate, her apologies more frequent, and her attempts at reconciliation more fervent. But despite her efforts, the emotional distance between us remained a chasm. I maintained my stance, unwilling to offer her the comfort or forgiveness she sought. Julia's decline into despair was palpable. The emotional pressure she faced, stemming from the wreckage of her affair, the fallout from Matt's scandal, and my aloofness, was overwhelming. She found herself caught in a cycle of self-recrimination and sorrow. Struggling to make sense of her choices and their repercussions, her attempts to rekindle our relationship were increasingly met with my cold, detached responses. Each time she reached out, she was met with the stark reality that I was no longer the partner she had once known. The emotional strain of her situation weighed heavily on her, and the contrast between her hopeful attempts and my unyielding distance only deepened her sense of isolation. As Julia continued to grapple with her emotional turmoil, the rift between us seemed to grow ever wider. The pain of betrayal, the disintegration of her relationship with Matt, and the emotional chasm that now separated us created a storm of anguish that seemed impossible to navigate. The facade of normalcy was slipping away, leaving behind a landscape marked by regret and sorrow. The emotional pressure had taken its toll, leaving Julia in a state of profound despondency. She faced the painful reality of her situation, unable to bridge the gap between us and struggling to reconcile with the fallout of her choices. As she descended into a state of deep sorrow, I remained a distant observer, maintaining the emotional distance that had become a shield against the storm of her betrayal. The chaos surrounding Matt's downfall had reached its climax. Once a prominent figure in his industry, he was now facing the full brunt of his scandalous fall from grace. The cascading consequences of the leaked information had culminated in a dramatic shift. Matt was dismissed from his position, his career in ruins. And he was now a pariah, vilified by both the media and the public. The formal announcement of Matt's dismissal from his company was met with widespread media coverage. The headlines were unforgiving, painting him as the embodiment of corporate corruption and personal failure. His once stalwart reputation had disintegrated, leaving him as the subject of scathing articles and public scorn. Matt's attempts to salvage his career had been in vain. The legal battles, the public relations efforts, and the frantic attempts to distance himself from the scandal all failed to stem the tide of condemnation. The pressure had become unbearable, and he found himself isolated, stripped of his professional identity and credibility. The weight of public judgment and professional disgrace took a heavy toll on him, pushing him further into the shadows of obscurity. As Matt's world crumbled, Julia was left to confront the fallout alone. Her relationship with Matt had been built on a shaky foundation, and now that he was a public figure of scorn, she was left to grapple with the absence of the support she had once relied on. The emotional and social support she had hoped to find in Matt was now a distant memory, replaced by the stark reality of her solitude. Julia's attempts to reach out for help or support were met with cold indifference. Friends and colleagues who had once been sympathetic were now wary, distancing themselves from the fallout of the scandal. Her attempts to rebuild her professional and personal life were met with resistance. And the weight of public opinion was a constant burden. The emotional isolation that Julia faced was profound. The sense of betrayal and the harsh judgment from those around her left her feeling abandoned. The void left by Matt's departure from her life was filled with a deep sense of loneliness, and her attempts to reconnect with others were met with an awkward mixture of pity and avoidance. Despite her efforts to find solace or redemption, Julia was confronted with the stark reality of her situation. The public condemnation, the collapse of her relationship with Matt, and the lack of support from those around her combined to create a formidable barrier to her recovery. She was left to navigate the wreckage of her life, grappling with the consequences of her actions and the isolation that had become her new reality. Throughout this period, I remained neutral. My emotional distance from Julia was deliberate, a reflection of my need to maintain control over my responses and interactions. I observed the unfolding drama with a sense of detachment, maintaining a careful balance between acknowledging the reality of her situation and preserving my boundaries. As Matt's career disintegrated and Julia faced the harsh consequences of her choices, the once familiar dynamics of our relationships were irrevocably altered. The crisis had brought with it a painful clarity, exposing the deep fractures that had developed over time. The fallout was now a defining element of their lives, and the ripple effects of their actions were impossible to ignore. Julia's solitary struggle and Matt's public disgrace were the harsh outcomes of their betrayal. The crisis had laid bare the consequences of their decisions, and the path forward was marred by regret and isolation. As they faced the repercussions of their actions, the landscape of their lives had irrevocably changed, leaving them to confront the reality of their own making. The dust of the scandal had finally begun to settle, but the aftermath was far from over. As I looked around at the wreckage left behind, I made a decision that was as pragmatic as it was painful. I would stay with Julia. The choice was driven not by any lingering affection, but by a complex mixture of familial obligation and the unsettling aftermath of the revenge I had meticulously orchestrated. Julia, now a shadow of her former self, was grappling with the consequences of her actions and the collapse of her relationship with Matt. The isolation she faced was palpable, and the strain of her public disgrace was evident in every hesitant interaction. Her attempts to find normalcy in our shared life were earnest but fraught with tension. It was clear that the damage done was profound and the road to recovery would be long and arduous. I chose to remain with Julia, not out of a desire to rekindle our past connection, but because of a deeper sense of responsibility. The family we had built together was important to me, and despite the betrayal and heartbreak, I couldn't bring myself to completely sever the ties. The decision to stay was driven by a complex web of emotions: duty, a sense of unresolved commitment, and the practicality of maintaining stability for our family. Our relationship, however, was no longer the same. The warmth and intimacy that had once defined us had been replaced by a cold, pragmatic interaction. I approached our interactions with a cautious distance, carefully managing my responses and emotions. The familiarity we had once shared had given way to a form of detachment, a protective measure against the pain and disillusionment that lingered. The satisfaction I had felt from my calculated revenge on Matt was tempered by an internal struggle. The success of my plans had come at a significant personal cost. The knowledge that my actions had led to Matt's professional downfall and Julia's profound isolation was a double-edged sword. While there was a certain grim satisfaction in the retribution I had exacted, it was accompanied by a deep sense of internal conflict and the realization of the personal betrayal involved. The contrast between the external success and the internal turmoil was stark. I had achieved what I set out to do, and the consequences of Matt's actions had been harshly meted out. But the victory was hollow, marred by the emotional wreckage it had left behind. The very act of vengeance that had once seemed so just and righteous had now become a source of profound inner conflict. Julia's attempts to rebuild our life together were met with my restrained acceptance. We maintained a semblance of normalcy, but the emotional distance was palpable. The days were filled with a mechanical routine, devoid of the warmth and connection that had once characterized our relationship. The practicalities of daily life continued, but the emotional void remained a constant presence. As we navigated this new chapter, the satisfaction of revenge was tempered by the ongoing reality of our changed relationship. The internal contradictions and personal betrayal were an inescapable part of the equation. The family remained intact, but the price of maintaining it had been the erosion of our once deep connection. In the quiet moments of reflection, I grappled with the duality of my situation, the satisfaction of achieving my goals and the profound personal cost that accompanied it. The new normal was a landscape marked by compromise and disillusionment, where the echoes of past decisions continued to resonate in the present.